Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing marvellously well, and I hope you're going to get that perfect drink, and you're keeping yourself lovely and warm wherever you are. And if the temperatures are freezing, do let me know, because some people are very cold at the moment, and if you're living in a hot part of the world, then let us know about it too, and also what it is that you enjoy drinking. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's start together with tonight's story, shall we? Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, there were no signs on the horizon that this day for me would be any different to the next, much like the devastating day when the Twin Towers came crumbling down in New York City. By all accounts, the day started like any other, as the people bustled happily around the city, making their way to work, picking up their regular cup of coffee from the cafe and a donut from their favourite bakers, as they sauntered off to work, never perceiving for a moment that New York City was hanging by a hair's breadth on the precipice of a looming catastrophic disaster, when something calamitous would happen that would invariably shake the world to its core, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. In the dreadful, direful, woeful aftermath, many of us lamenting Americans began to taste the pernicious, repugnant, vile flavour of evil as we watched the spiralling smoke billow out the rubble of what remained of the two great towering landmarks of the southwestern tip of Manhattan near the Hudson River, a few blocks northwest of Wall Street in New York City, the familiar imposing silhouettes that would never grace the skyline again. Some would swear that within the smoke itself they saw the iniquitous shapes and faces of demons, and when I myself viewed the ungodly footage, I could not dispute their claims. It was like that for me, a benign, regular day that seemed as normal as any other, but for me this day would end up being a Twin Tower event on a personal level that would shatter me to my very foundations. The frail, slender scaffolding of my human body would similarly come crumbling down in a pathetic, towering heap, much like the Twin Towers had done. Soon I would become blazingly aware that there is evil living among us, surreptitiously hiding in the dark shadows, trying to appear innocuous, temperate, and invisible, but in truth it is anything but. Just because you cannot see it does not mean it is not there. Sometimes this evil rises like the billowing smoke of the Twin Towers and latches on to the unsuspecting stranger, seizing them unaware with her duplicitous cunning until you're crying out for help as she presses you down with her suffocating arms, desperately trying to squeeze the breath out of your lungs so that death may become the victor and you the unsuspecting victim. Well, that is what it was like for me on the day when my intuition had been so easily fleeced. I had been oblivious to the impending danger that would unhesitantly overtake me on the wind like an owl swooping down to grab an unwary mouse, in the blinking of an eye, for that is all it takes. I remember the routine regularities of that normal day with a haunting, airy clarity, because like any day embroiled with a disaster, even those minor, insignificant details, like what I had for breakfast that morning, never become washed away or faded by the passing of time, like a dark pair of blue jeans that fades beyond recognition after 100 washes in the washing machine, so that it looks like a completely different item of clothing, not bad or good, just conspicuously different. I do remember getting up slightly late that morning, as my alarm had failed to shatter the silence with its offensive, loud, blaring noise. I had invested in the worst kind of alarm, so that it would thoroughly annoy me, so much so that I'd be forced to get out of bed to shut the bloody thing up. Excuse the bad language. Suffice to say, the alarm did not go off this morning, something that had never happened to me before. Maybe it was the universe trying to suggest I didn't leave the confines of my bed this morning, sending me that suggestive warning nudge that I foolishly chose to ignore. More fool me. But you know what they say, there's no fool like an old fool. I had left a crack in my bedroom curtain, and so a bright beam of sunlight burst into my bedroom like an annoying headlight, staring you blindly in the face. It was this invasive, intrusive sunlight searing over my face, causing me to squint uncomfortably as the heat of the sun burnt my eyelids. It was that uncomfortable, blinding mid-morning sun that made me glance at the clock. I gasped in horror. I was 2 hours late for work. How had this happened? I was supposed to be in the offices by 9, and it was 11:10 already. I was running very, very late. Hastily I jumped out of my bed, faster than a Jack Marsh hare, and dashed hurriedly towards the wardrobe, throwing on my clothes as fast as I could, knowing that being late for work would not earn me any brownie points with the boss. My large cat Bella looked up at me through her yellow eyes, as if wondering what all the fuss was all about. "I'm running late, Bella," I told her. "Don't look at me like that. If I lose my job, bang goes your favourite cat food," I threatened. My mellow, lackadaisical cat did not look desperately impressed with me. She stretched her paw out across the duvet and closed both her eyes, continuing to sleep. I ran briskly to the bedroom mirror, glancing at my dreadful reflection. My brown hair hung around my face in what looked like limp, twisted knots, and one end of my hair was standing on edge rather like a hedgehog. I quickly brushed it down so that my straight hair began to resemble its normal bob. I quickly threw on a touch of lipstick and mascara and ran out of the house faster than I've ever done before. Needless to say, when I arrived at work, my boss, Marcus Farrow, did not hesitate to give me some reproachful, reproving looks, but he never had the guts to ask me to my face why I was late. But let's just say, if looks could kill, he was wearing those looks, as his boot face looked exceedingly captious. I work for a web designer company, so I quickly got down to my computer and began to work trying to make amends for my lack of punctuality, bypassing the blueberry muffin and the coffee I would normally have enjoyed to give me that quintessential buzz, so that by lunchtime my energy was rarely flagging. Me and my friends sat under an oak tree together at the local park during lunch break, enjoying our sandwiches and watching a cute little squirrel scurrying up a tree branch, eyeing us both with bright brown eyes. The park was filled with the usual dog walkers taking their dogs for a leisurely stroll, and people sitting on park benches eating their lunches and breathing in the fresh, crisp air. For many locals working in a big bustling city like New York, they're always looking for an escapism, so many gravitate towards the park to be soothed and caressed reassuringly by the natural world. It was so cool in the park on this day, with its sumptuous acres of viridescent green grass, blue sky, along with a plethora of trees that were scattered liberally across this resplendent oasis. A wonderful respite from the beige blandness of the office, with its dull, poky, officey decor, drab wooden desks, uninspiring-looking computers, metal filing cabinets, not exactly riveting scenery, shall we say, without putting too fine a point on it. "You were a hell of a late this morning," said my friend Amanda, taking a large bite of her tuna mayo sandwich. "I couldn't help noticing the dirty looks Mr. Farrow was giving you." "Tell me about that," I said. I could feel his eyes drilling through my back. I think it would be infinitely better if he'd just shout at me. Unfortunately, my alarm clock didn't go off this morning. Amanda rolled her eyes. "You better be on time for court next week. You know you can't be late for that." "I know," I sighed. "I'll have to check my alarm when I get home to see why it didn't go off, or there'll be hell to pay, especially if I'm late again for work tomorrow. That, or I'll get Lydia to wake me up, as we're going to court together." "Might be a good idea," said Amanda. We were both witnesses in a court case we were attending next week. Me and my friend Lydia, who shares an apartment with me, had been viewing another apartment in a different area. We had to confirm the identity of the man that we'd seen running away from a woman he'd attacked on a New York sidewalk. We had to prove that he was the man we'd witnessed running away from the scene with a bloody knife in his hand and blood spatter all over his shirt. He was being charged for attempted murder and grievous bodily assault. I'll never forget his face as I stared into his enraged eyes as he ran away from the scene. Me and my friend Lydia, who worked in the same offices and of course shared the same apartment, both knew we would never forget his face as long as we lived. It was seared in our brain like an indelible tattoo that could never ever be erased. He was a young man in his early 20s with a hard face, with a very distinctive jagged scar running down the side of his cheek that I've never seen before in another person. so it hadn't been terribly difficult to identify the man in a lineup. Needless to say, Lydia had also picked out the very same man, so the police were fully satisfied that he was indeed the violent attacker of this poor unsuspecting woman. It would seem that me and Lydia were regarded as the two vital witnesses for the prosecution. Ostensibly, the thug who assaulted the victim didn't know who the witnesses were, as on the day in question we so happened to be walking down an unfamiliar street. Thankfully, we weren't local to the area, so we didn't have to go under some kind of witness protection. Even so, I wasn't looking forward to testifying against this morose, uncouth individual. I had been the one that had called 911 that day. Fortunately, favour shined down on the poor girl when we rescued her from her attacker. We had found her lying there in a crumpled heap on the ground. In the end, she did not die from her injuries, as the knife that was thrust into her chest missed her main artery. She was one lucky lady. I told him he could take my bag, she told us, but he still stabbed me, in what I assumed was her dying breath, as she lay there bleeding, lying in a pool of her own blood. The poor girl had drifted into unconsciousness after she'd said those final ominous words. I thought she would be dead before the emergency services arrived and rushed her off to hospital. It was hauntingly surreal, as we watched the efficient EMTs placing the bedraggled form of the victim on a gurney, throwing her faster than greased lightning into the back of the ambulance. I remember there was just so much blood. The air was filled with the pungent smell of copper. I could even taste it on my tongue. I remember the earnest, knowing glances of the EMTs as they exchanged ominous looks, and from their resigned expressions, Lydia and I deduced that this wasn't going to end well for the young girl. She had lost way too much blood, but arriving at the hospital with the prompt efficiency of the standby team and extra blood available, she made a full, miraculous recovery, although I was in no doubt that the emotional injuries would take a whole lot longer to heal for her. I had learnt that she was undergoing trauma counselling, and I wasn't at all surprised. As we continued eating our lunch at the park, Amanda questioned me about how I felt about standing in as a witness for next week, under the cross-examination of a judge in a courtroom. I haven't really given the matter much thought, I said, but now you're asking me this question, I'm beginning to feel somewhat unhinged. I imagine it'll be exactly like the courtroom scenes you see on television when they cross-examine the witness. The defence might try and undermine your testimony. What do you mean? Amanda put on a man's voice and pretended to be the defence. I put it to you, Miss Anderson, that you think you saw my client attack this woman, but I am very sure you must be mistaken. Well, I said, I'll insist I remember the jagged scar on the side of his cheek, and his piercing blue eyes. I don't mean to scare you, said Amanda, but I just need to warn you these defence lawyers can get terribly nasty, and when I say nasty, I mean vindictively nasty, so you need to watch your back and make sure you don't allow the man to intimidate you too much. The whole object is for him to make the jury doubt your testimony. He may even try and undermine you as a person, so that the jury will doubt your credibility. They're very good at doing that. Well, I don't see how he can do that. I've never broken the law or been arrested for being intoxicated, so I'm not exactly the defence's best friend. Even so, they have their ways of discrediting a prosecution witness and subverting their character, so you must watch out for that. How does Lydia feel about testifying? Well, she's not feeling good about it at all. She thinks we should have undergone witness protection anyway, but we weren't local to the area, and I very much doubt the man would even remember what we looked like, or even where we live. Oh, I wouldn't be sure about that, said Amanda. You can never be too careful. You both need to watch your backs, and I mean that. Well, Lydia's got to be in her bonnet about it. She's convinced she's being stalked. Amanda grimaced. That is not good. I don't think Lydia would imagine that, surely. I think you can sense if someone's following you. You have a sixth sense about things like that. In the circumstances, you would be well advised to go to the police to express your concerns. If Lydia feels she's been stalked, they'll take the two of you very seriously and immediately put you under witness protection. I think they should have done so anyway. You can never be too careful these days. Some of those criminal types have these guileful ways of shutting up witnesses. So from the sounds of things, you really both need to tread very carefully. I'll discuss it with her tonight when we walk home together to our apartment. Sounds like a jolly good idea to me, said Amanda. I must confess I hadn't given the court case much thought, but after Amanda's inauspicious, somewhat baleful warnings about Lydia potentially being followed, I was beginning to feel rather concerned. It was late in the afternoon when we were both walking home together to our New York apartment. I began to tell her all about what Amanda had told me. She doesn't think you're imagining things, I told her. She believes if you sense you're being followed, then it's very likely to be true. Lydia looked at me gratefully. So you believe me now too, she said, her blue eyes growing earnest. I promise you, at lunchtime today when I went to that local cafe I usually go to for lunch, I saw a man with a hoodie. He kept a distance behind me, but he followed me into the cafe. And when I went to sit down at a table, I could see him in my peripheral vision, and he was watching me. He really creeped me out. But when I turned around to look directly at him, he looked another way. He was talking on his cell phone while he was looking at me. It was like he was up to no good. I had chills in my bones. What did he look like? I asked. Well, I couldn't see him. I mean, it was a fine day and he was wearing a hoodie. I mean, who does that? Someone who doesn't want to be noticed, I said. Are you kidding me? Laughed Lydia. What could possibly be more conspicuous than wearing a hoodie on a bright sunny day, I ask you? I even heard one man saying to him, What's your problem, bro? Are you living on another planet? It's a sauna outside and you're wearing a hoodie. What did he say? He said, Piss off, you wanker. The man responded in kind and said, Ditto to you too. Sounds like a nasty piece of work, I said. What horrible, nasty language to use. What you're saying to me, Lydia, is very unsettling. We need to go to the police to report this chap, whoever he is. It was late afternoon, but was still bright, cheerful and sunny on the street that was prettily lined with tall, statuesque oak trees that were swaying their boughs in a soft afternoon breeze. Then it happened. A powerful off-road vehicle with hefty tyres accelerated his engine. I could hear the brrr sound. It bypassed the asphalt road, plunging onto the pavement, heading directly towards us. There was no escape, except for us to back into the red brick wall. Then the mysterious vehicle, with its powerful, thick rubber tyres, crushed everything in its wake, went thrusting right through us. The entire brick wall came tumbling down into a heap of crumpled bricks. I remember screaming, "Oh God, please no!" And then I recall nothing after that, apart from faint cries, ambulance sirens, and hearing a doctor in accident and emergency asking him if I could hear him. I tried to nod, but I couldn't. A year later, after this harrowing ordeal, my life had irredeemably and irrevocably changed. The ill-fated accident had severely impacted my life, and not in a good way either. I had suffered many broken bones, a bad concussion in the accident, as well as traumatic head injury, that terminally, irreversibly perforated and damaged my eardrums, and blood flow to the cochlea had also been thwarted. Then there were small bones in the middle ear that had been severely damaged, as well as abrupt changes in the sequence and flow of air pressure in my ears. Suffice to say, I'd walked away deaf in both ears, and now had to live my life as a deaf person. I also suffered from frequent dizzy spells and issues with balance. As for Lydia, she didn't get away so easily, as she died on impact. We couldn't prove anything, but it was expediently convenient that a powerful off-road vehicle plunged through 2 witnesses for the prosecution that would be testifying in court the following week. The vehicle had simply failed to stop, driving away into the late afternoon as if nothing had happened, much like a hit and run. It would seem local witnesses had reported a dark, powerful vehicle with massive tyres and blacked-out windows literally accelerating off the road onto the pavement, plunging right into the 2 of us with a forceful impact, and then absconding from the scene faster than greased lightning. It was definitely deliberate, the witnesses had explained. It didn't look like an accident. I was convinced that we'd been mown down by thugs who were determined we would not be able to testify in the trial the following week. Without any real witnesses coming forward, the man who stabbed that poor woman with the full intention of murdering her had got away with his insidious crime. I was to learn he had run off with her purse, containing $2,000 in cash, which she had taken out of a bank ATM only moments before. I think he must have been witness to this transaction, and was determined to mug her as a result. I was certain Lydia was absolutely right. She had been followed. None of this would have happened if we had been under police protection. My life was filled with so many regrets and what-ifs, but my trauma counsellor had advised me that I couldn't punish myself for what had happened. Tanya, she had said to me, looking at me with a stern expression on her face, I hear this all the time from my clients. If only I had done this and not that. If only I had listened or paid attention. If only I hadn't reacted so impulsively. If only I had this. If only I had that. I hear all my clients use the if only word as if it's seared on their soul in blue ink. Now, Lydia, if only is a very negative word. How is it ever going to help you? You have to accept what's happened and move on with your life. Acceptance is key, for if you fail to accept, you'll be stuck in a bubble of depression that will rob you of embracing life with both of your hands. You're alive, and that certainly is something to celebrate. Yes, you're deaf, but it could have been a whole lot worse. Instead of looking at a cup half full, embrace the positives. You're alive, you're healthy, you're well, you can see, smell and touch. Those are positive things worthy of celebration and gratitude. It's all right for you, I protested. You can't imagine what it's like to be deaf. My entire life has been turned upside down and back to front. I don't hear a thing anymore. The only thing that wakes me up in the morning is a vibrating alarm clock that flashes like an ambulance light. I've had to learn sign language and to read people's lips, and that's terribly difficult. But my whole world is so quiet now. You can't imagine what life is like in a soundless world. Sometimes I just want to scream. Good, Tonya. I'm glad you're finally expressing your feelings. That's terribly important. You definitely need to vent your anger. Release all your frustration. But you must accept that you're deaf now. I can imagine it's a huge adjustment to have to make. It can't be easy living in a soundless world. But there's no reason why you cannot have a very good and full life. Many deaf people are very happy indeed. Well, I lost my job as a web designer. Now that wasn't fair. Mr. Farrow, my boss, said I had to speak to my clients on the telephone, and if I couldn't hear what they had to say, there was no way I could keep my job. Yes, I agree. It is an unfair world. We live in an all-seeing, hearing world that doesn't necessarily accommodate the hard of hearing or the hard of seeing. But I promise you this, there are jobs out there for you, and companies that are actively encouraged to hire those with physical impediments like yours. Now, I want you to know, Tonya, that I'm very pleased with your progress to date. But the next part of your therapy is to go away on your own for a couple of weeks into the countryside. And when I say away on your own, I mean on your own. You can't have anyone with you. This is a time you've got to spend with yourself. But why? What good would that do? It's a whole lot of good for you, Tonya. I find when my clients go away for a couple of weeks on their own to the countryside, or to the Oregon coast, the choice is yours. They come back transformed, regenerated, and so much more positive about their lives. I want you to take long walks in nature, study a butterfly darting from one flower to another, run your hands down the bark of a tree, smell a rose, watch a bird tweeting on a branch, allow the soft sunshine to warm your back, soak in the beautiful views. I still don't get why you think it would be a good idea for me to go out into the natural world. Because I do, said my trauma counsellor. I want you to trust me on this, Tonya. I'm of the firm opinion that the natural world is the greatest healer of all. She works on us in a unique way. She'll give you exactly what you need, no more, no less. Then you'll come back inspired. You will resume your therapy. But nature can do so much more for you than I ever will be able to. I've seen some of my clients almost suicidal, eager to give up on their lives. And when they resume their counselling with me after being out in the natural world, their attitude completely shifts. They have a skip in their step and an upbeat attitude, and that is going to happen to you. But where will I go? That's for you to decide, said my counsellor. I liked her because her lips were so easy to read. She didn't overcompensate with her lips that some people were inclined to do when they learnt I was deaf. Why don't you go online? See if you can find a location that tickles your fancy. That's your homework tonight. I'll see you when you get back, Tonya. Have a fabulous trip, she said. And that was that. Hence I was now in the resort town of Banff, which is in Alberta, Canada, located in the Banff National Park. It is the stupendous mountainous peaks of Mount Rundle and Mount Cascade, part of the Rocky Mountains that dominate the skyline. I was standing on Banff Avenue, which is the main thoroughfare, where there are boutiques, restaurants, chateau-style hotels, souvenir shops, and so much more. The vast area of parkland is home to a wonderful mix of wildlife, from elk to grizzly bears, and the list goes on and on. I had decided to come here based on all the pictures I'd seen online that had hijacked my attention with a wondrous awe, for the aquamarine lakes, hot springs, and intoxicating mountain scenery rarely held my appeal. I was here in Banff shopping for essential supplies, after which I had booked myself into a remote wooden cabin. I was already feeling butterflies of excitement in my stomach that were flapping around my belly. I marvelled at the exquisite transfixing views of this marvellous place. One thing I'd noticed about becoming deaf is that my senses had sharpened immeasurably, as if to compensate for the shortcomings of my hearing impediment. My sense of smell had become extraordinarily pronounced and very sharp, so that the delicious smells of cinnamon buns that wafted down the street were so pronounced I literally followed them all the way to the bakery, and I couldn't resist buying 6 cinnamon buns. I could smell the flowers in the window boxes before I'd even seen them. Before I was deaf, I don't think I would have noticed them at all. The town of Banff was exquisite, a rarely beguiling mountain town that is postcard perfect, the kind of place you see on boxes of Swiss chocolates. It's just that beautiful, with the shallow-style shops, the huge colourful window boxes on the edge of the pavements full of spring flowers, the interesting eclectic shops, and those arresting mountain views set against a cobalt blue sky. There's only one word to describe it, and that is breathtaking. I was beginning to comprehend why my trauma counsellor had sent me to the countryside. I was feeling much more positive about my life. I had even brought myself a pretty summer dress from one of the boutiques, soft, flowing, loose-fitting. The shop assistant had told me that I looked $1 million. I love loose clothes on slender people like you, she said. You look absolutely terrific, and the white cotton looks fabulous with your dark hair. Has anyone told you that you bear a striking, remarkable resemblance to the Duchess of Cambridge, Prince William's wife? Only you're a lot prettier and your hair shorter. Thanks, I said, my face beaming with the compliment. I mean, who doesn't like being compared with the princess? Although I was pretty much against the establishment and the monarchy, as every country belongs to its people. It's the job of the establishment or the elected presidential party to do the will of the people, not the other way round. Sometimes many of the people in power seem to quickly forget that. I was soon buying some groceries at the store, and I waited for my taxi to collect me. Thankfully, he was right on time. The kind, very attentive taxi driver had helped me collect all my shopping and the baggage that I'd left in a public locker and put it into the back of his trunk. Then there we were, out on the open road, well on my merry way to the mysterious cabin I'd booked. "I understand you became recently deaf," said the taxi driver, when his car had reached a stop sign so he could turn around for me to read his lips. "What is life like living in a world without sound, I wonder?" I was impressed, as no one had really asked me that question, or even grasped the gravity of what it was like living without sound. It's a huge adjustment, it really is. I don't know how to describe it to you, but it can feel awfully lonely at times. It's rather like watching a silent movie every day of your life. I miss the sound of voices, music, bird song, and even sounds that warn you about impending danger. It's been difficult living in a soundless world. When the taxi driver got to the very next stop, he turned around so I could read his lips. "I imagine it must be very challenging, in effect overhauling your entire life and adapting to a new way of living, especially for one who has the ability, or who had the ability, shall I say, to hear before. In a way, someone born deaf doesn't know what they're missing, as they were born that way, so they don't know any different. But you know what you're missing, so that is exceedingly hard. I commend you, young lady, for your incredible courage." "Thanks," I said. "That's very kind of you to say. My trauma counsellor keeps telling me we need to learn to accept change, for it happens to us all in our lives. Moving house, for example, losing a loved one or a pet. She says change is a quintessential part of life that we all need to embrace." "She's not wrong about that, love," said the taxi driver. "I should know. I've been divorced twice. I came from a broken home myself. I had 2 stepmothers. I've moved to 3 states over the last few years. I lost my mother to a brain aneurysm 2 years back. So change is my middle name. It happens to us all. None of us can actually avoid it." The taxi driver travelled down many dirt roads, surrounded by undulating embankments scattered with larches, pines and aspen polar trees, along with pretty flowering meadows, beguiling mountain views. We took a turning down a road that curled through the valley, and the taxi driver stopped to allow a herd of elk to scatter across the road in a group, many glancing at us briefly. In my humble opinion, they seemed remarkably tame for wild deer, as if they weren't unused to humans. "Just to let you know, we're nearly there, love. Do you realize the cabin you have booked is out in the middle of nowhere?" he said, turning around to look at me, while he momentarily stopped the car so that I could read his lips. "You're not going to feel a bit isolated out here. A young girl on her own," he said, looking genuinely concerned, "is a little bit of a concern for me." "That's the whole idea of me coming out here," I assured him. "My trauma counsellor is most insistent of me being out in nature on my own. She says that nothing heals as much as the natural world." The taxi driver reflected about it for a moment. "I think I would hasten to agree with your therapist. If there's any place that is going to heal you, it's here in Banff. When I moved here from Atlanta, I will tell you something. I was on the brink of despair after my second marriage collapsed. The wife was cheating on me. I was devastated, as you can imagine. But when I moved out here, the beauty of this place changed my life." It wasn't long before the taxi drove up this precipitous hilly incline. Up and down it went, as its wheels rolled smoothly down the hilly terrain with effortless ease, until finally the road narrowed towards a gravel path that finally meandered towards the cabin. In my opinion, the cabin, although twee, resembled a Swiss chalet in every regard. It looked whimsically enchanting all on its own, in the heart of this arresting valley, surrounded by viridescent rolling hills, fields of sagebrush, meadows, and a plethora of pretty towering alpine trees that sprawled out into a vast area of wood green, where I could see there were some steep walking trails that looked very inviting. I felt as if I was being welcomed by the trees and the flowers, blanketed by this charming oasis, cushioned cosily by its sumptuous persuasion. The taxi driver helped me with all my baggage and groceries, I'm glad to say. "I think it's very beautiful here," he said. "Are you sure you won't get terribly lonely?" "I'll be absolutely fine," I assured him. "I've brought over a dozen books to read with me. If I need a change of scenery, I'll SMS the taxi service and take a trip into Banff to do a spot of shopping. There's electricity in the cabin, so I'll be able to get a Wi-Fi connection." The taxi driver gave me his card. "Good. Then you can give me an SMS if you need to go to Banff." I thanked the taxi driver, watching him driving away in his taxi, until his vehicle was a tiny speck on the horizon. Then I took the key from under the welcome mat, turned it in the lock, opened the door, and surreptitiously entered the cabin. I gasped at its coziness. It was as snug as a bug, so inviting on the inside, as much as it was on the outside. Suddenly the idea of having this place surrounded by all these enchanting views all to myself seemed very appealing indeed. It was like having a whole chocolate cake to myself, instead of just a measly slice. I felt spoilt and privileged to be here. I was so glad I'd come. The cabin was open-plan living at its finest, with a sweeping staircase that led up to the 2 upstairs bedrooms, and a balcony that overlooked the most magnificent views. The bedrooms possessed the most enormous king-size beds, with mattresses that you could sink into like soft beds of feathery down. It was like no expense had been spared to make this enchanting cabin as luxurious as possible. The white bed linen was made from the finest Egyptian cottons, the duvets and pillows were goose down, and there was a plethora of different shades of white that complemented aquamarines and golds in a colour palette that enhanced the dark wood. The results were phenomenal. Even the pictures on the wall were contemporary artworks, done in aquamarines, golds, pinks, lilacs and soft blues, framed in white, so striking against the dark wooden beams. The first week in the cabin had been dreamy. I'd indulged in long hot bubble baths at night, infused with orange blossom essential oil, surrounded by over a dozen lighted candles. I had soaked luxuriantly in the bath, wallowing away like a hippo in a watering hole in Africa, although I assure you I'm significantly smaller in size, I'm glad to say. I had laid back in my bed, reading sometimes to the early hours of the morning, drinking a glass of high-quality white wine. I'd get out of my bed at lunchtime, go for a leisurely stroll in the woods. I would return home and in the kitchen whip up something delicious to eat. Sometimes at night I had an open fire. When it became cool, I enjoyed the pleasure of watching the orange-red flames crackle and spit in the hearth. It had all been so cosy. I was surprised how out here I forgot about my deafness, and even when I couldn't hear the sound of the birds, I allowed myself to remember those sounds so that I could almost hear them in my imagination, which meant that indirectly I was hearing. One night I awoke with a start. I didn't know why I'd woken up, as I couldn't hear anything at all, but let's just say my instincts were heightened. I got the distinct impression that I wasn't alone. I felt as if something was looking at me. I climbed out of my bed and went from window to window to see if I could see anything, but nothing was there. I glanced out of all the windows, but all I could see was the greyish sky that wasn't so dark, as a full moon cast its shadows across the landscape like a bright lantern. I could discern the silhouettes of the tall vertical trees, the background of the rolling hills. I remember thinking how beautiful everything was. I decided as I was up and about, I would sit on the upper balcony with a glass of wine in my hands and drink it, enjoying a panoramic view of the constellations with the bright twinkling stars and a cheerful moon casting its wispy silvery shadows over the countryside. Then I would return to bed after I'd finished my drink. But that was when I saw this tall, dark, shadowy silhouette disappearing into the woods. It happened so quickly, but I knew by its human shape that it was certainly not a bear. But then what was it? I was so intrigued that I didn't think of my own safety, which after my recent trauma you would think would be foremost in my mind, but it seemed marginally suppressed this evening. Perhaps it was the heady effects of the orange blossom bath that I'd had earlier in the evening, complemented by the relaxing effects of the wine, that I was now feeling exceedingly chilled out and mellow. I wanted to know what this thing was that I'd seen. It even crossed my mind that I might have seen a ghost, and that thought rather excited me for some reason. After having so nearly died in my recent accident, I had a fleeting memory of being in a hospital bed and flung out of my body for a second, only to be pushed back as I heard this voice saying to me, "It's not your time yet." I remember being incredibly annoyed, as I knew that what was out there beyond this reality was so much better than what this world had to offer me. So after my experience in hospital, I was definitely open to the idea of ghosts. I quickly grabbed my headlight, threw on some sneakers and my dressing gown, and dashed out of the cabin as fast as I could, running towards where I'd seen the dark, shadowy figure. I could feel butterflies of excitement whirling around in my stomach. I'm sure the crickets and frogs were chirping, but I could hear only the sound of silence. I could feel a gentle breeze blowing against my face that was very invigorating. And that was when I saw him. He was a tall, dark, towering silhouette, standing against a tree, easily over 7 foot tall, and possibly 600 to 700 pounds. He was burly and big, with powerful shoulders and a body that was built for toughness, speed, endurance, and strength. By contrast, our human bodies seemed pathetically puny. He was covered with long, flowing, dark hair, and possessed a human-like face with high cheekbones and a very defined square jawline. But it was his brown eyes that consumed my undivided attention. They were like liquid pools of unconditional love. I realized with reverent horror that I was actually looking at a Bigfoot. It was the critter's benevolent eyes that delivered me from any fear or trepidation, which would be easy to acquire given the strength and intimidating, daunting power of this mighty beast, which would likely terrify some of the most courageous men. The creature was eyeing me curiously. He looked deep into my eyes and said, "I've been expecting you." I was flabbergasted. Was this creature talking to me in my mind? But these words I were hearing were definitely not my own. I looked at the creature with a flabbergasted expression, not knowing what to say. He looked at me and pointed to my ears and said, "You agreed to this before you were born." I realized he was referring to my deafness. Are you kidding, I thought. I'd never in my right mind agree to anything like this. Never, ever. Who would ever ask to be deaf? The creature said to me, "Be brave, my child. All will be well with you. Remember, you are greatly loved. May the good Lord bless you." And then he turned around and glided away. What the hell, I thought. What was that all about? But for some reason the Bigfoot's words soothed my soul. If I had really agreed to my deafness before I was even born, then what did I have to complain about, I thought. I don't know why the Bigfoot was sent to give me this message, or who asked him to give it to me, but it most certainly changed my life. And it was my encounter with this anomalous beast that enabled me to live my life as a deaf woman to the fullest. Who sent the Bigfoot to me, as I was saying, I don't know. And why was he expecting me? I can't answer that question either. But the therapist was absolutely right. It was in the natural world that I found my healing. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.